Hello and welcome to this video tutorial brought to you by tutvid.com. Let's take a look at creating and using subtle textures and subtle patterns and things like that in web design. This isn't necessarily going to be a tutorial that's going to blow your socks off as far as teaching you incredible things, but I'd rather it be something that sort of gives you lots of ideas when it comes to web design and design in general, because subtlety is so key. You know, that whole cliche that we hear all the time, that simple is beautiful, and textures are a way to introduce just sort of this little wrinkle into your designs without going overboard and over the top. And it's this subtle beauty that adds depth and just goodness to anything you're designing. So let's go ahead and take a look at creating a texture and then applying it to this here sort of website mock-up that we're looking at. Now, before we get started, just take a look around the web. The web is loaded with insanely high quality and free textures. There's a wonderful website called subtlepatterns.com. Just absolutely great stuff here. All of this stuff, seamless patterns you can download. They're like PNG images, I believe. You download them, you can use them in Photoshop. I'm going to show you how you can convert them to patterns so you can use them in your projects. Super easy stuff, super cool stuff. Just, you gotta love it. Then this site, lostandtaken.com. These are more like big photographic textures, which are great as well. Usually I'll use this kind of stuff with my photography work, but still, all kinds of uses for this kind of pattern. And we're going to be taking a look at how to create a pattern out of something that doesn't have repeating edges as well. So something like here on Lost and Taken would be useful as well, even for a web or a graphic design project where you need that perfect seamless pattern. So keep that in mind. And then also the good old brusheasy.com. They have patterns as well, in addition to all the wonderful brushes that they provide. So don't forget about them. I actually don't use them all that much for patterns at all. Definitely would recommend subtlepatterns.com. Far and away the best site that I found and that I use, at least for my purposes. And it's going to be what we're going to be using today. So with that in mind, also actually before we move on, just keep in mind that really any photograph you have, any piece of artwork can be a texture. Don't let the term, texture define how you use any graphic or picture or photograph or anything that you take. Anything can be a texture. Just anything that has differentials between light and dark really can be some kind of a texture. Take it into Photoshop, play with blend modes, play with all kinds of stuff, and just get creative with it and have fun with it. And you can create patterns and textures out of virtually everything and anything. So if you know of any great texture resources, any great pattern resources, feel free to share them in the comments to this video as well. So there's about 1 billion different ways to create patterns. Typically what I like to do is, instead of trying to draw something from scratch, which I've tried before, it's just very time consuming, I usually like to start with a pattern or a photograph of some sort, just so I can start messing stuff up and playing with stuff. So that's what we're going to do. We're actually going to start creating our own pattern here in Photoshop, and then we're going to add 3 or 4 patterns from subtlepatterns.com, and I'm going to give you all the info you need for that. We're going to kind of hang out and do it together here, so let's just have some fun. Hop over into Photoshop and go File, New. You don't need any kind of web mockup or anything like that. This is just simply to give you guys an example of how I then would use this pattern that we're going to create in a web design. So go ahead and Photoshop, go File, New, and we're going to create a document of a very specific size, 500 pixels by 400 pixels, and we'll hit OK. Now, in this document, what we're going to do is start playing around with noise. So we're going to, on our background layer here, make sure our foreground and background color are set to white and black. You can just go ahead and hit the letter D. That reverts to default. And we'll go Filter, Noise, Add Noise. Now, we're going to add a bit of noise here. Let's try like 100%, something like that. Yeah, something like that looks pretty good. Now, you want to make sure this is set to Gaussian distribution, and you also want monochromatic turned on. See how when I shut it off, we get all those colors that are introduced? We don't want that. We want monochromatic, just black and white, no additional colors. Go ahead and hit OK. So now that we've done that, we're going to go Filter, Pixelate, Mosaic. And we're going to set the cell size to 20 squares, actually probably right about what I like. Go ahead and hit OK. The next thing to do is grab our first pattern from subtlepatterns.com. So subtlepatterns.com, and the first pattern we're looking for is one called Subtle Net. You can just punch it right into the search bar here. It'll come right up, and then go ahead and download it. It's going to download a .zip file. There it is on my desktop. I'm going to open it right up. I'm going to go into the SubtleNet folder. I'm going to choose both of the patterns, unzip them right to the desktop. There we go. I'm going to start with the second pattern file, or really it's just an image. We're going to create the actual pattern out of it in Photoshop. So I'm going to start with the second image file, and this is just basically the original pattern, but you can see 2x, so it's a little bit bigger. Drag it into Photoshop. I'm going to drop it on the toolbar up here. That's going to open it as a separate file. I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and we can see the pattern. What I want to do is make this a little bit darker, so it's going to be a little bit more pronounced. A piece of cake to do. Go Image, Adjustments, Levels. Here in Levels, we're going to grab the black handle, and we're going to drag it to the right. Drag it right over, right about there. So, right there. Perfect. With the input on 160. It looks just about perfect. Go ahead and hit OK. And we're going to say Edit, Define Pattern. Now that we've done this, we're just going to name it SubtleNet. And we can close this file. Don't worry about saving it. Now that we're in this document, we're going to go Layer, New Layer. And we can just hit OK. We're going to grab the Paint Bucket tool. The Paint Bucket tool is located underneath the Gradient tool. There's Paint Bucket tool. Great. Up here in the top toolbar, we're going to change foreground to pattern. So we're pouring out a pattern, not just a solid foreground color. And then from this little drop-down, the pattern drop-down menu here, we're just going to choose our newest pattern right here at the end. And we're going to dump it right in there. So we can see our pattern. Now, obviously, the mesh is great, but the lighter marks in between the mesh, that's filling in between the mesh, that's in our way. We need to get rid of that. So we can quickly get rid of that by taking that layer and setting it to a blend mode of multiply. Look at that. Perfect. We can see our mosaics right through our mesh. Now the mesh is a little bit too pronounced, so we're going to grab the opacity slider here, and we're just going to reduce this down to about somewhere around 20-25%. I would say looks pretty good. So now we're going to go and grab another pattern. Go back to Subtle Patterns, and our next pattern is called Vintage Speckles. So it's kind of a pretty subtle pattern, but I like it. We're going to download this. Again, go to the desktop. There it is. Open it right up. And again, open up Vintage Speckles, and then we're going to grab both of the images, unzip them, drop them on the desktop, close out our zip file, and we're going to start again with the second image, so the larger pattern. Drag it into Photoshop just like we did before, open it up as its own file. Now that we've done that, we're immediately just going to go Edit, Define Pattern, and we can call this Vint Spec, or Vintage Speckle, whatever, and we can close that out. Now create another new layer. Control-Shift-Alt or Command-Shift-Option-N is the hotkey, just to instantly create a new layer. Control-Shift-Alt-N. Piece of cake. Grab that Paint Bucket tool again and select from the pattern dropdown our latest pattern, which is the Vint Spec pattern, and dump it right in there. So you can see just these subtle specks. Now, to get rid of all the light, again, we just go Blend Mode, Normal, and set the normal blend mode to multiply. So just a couple little subtle specks. Now that I'm looking at this, I think it would be cool to take our original pattern, so that would be the sort of subtle net, but the smaller subtle net, and overlay it over this and see what we get. So let's go ahead and do that. Jump right back to the desktop. We still have that image up here. So here's the bigger one. Here's the smaller one. Grab this, drag it into Photoshop, open it as its own document. You can see it's just a little bit smaller. And I don't know if I want to make this one darker or not. Maybe I will make it darker. Why not? Bring up levels. The hotkey for that is Command or Control L. And bring that black handle over to, what was it, about 160 if I recall correctly. Hit OK. It doesn't have to be 160 exactly, by the way. Just something in the neighborhood of 160. Do what looks good to you. Hit OK. And we're going to define this guy as a pattern. So I'm going to say subnet. The cool thing about building your patterns using a bunch of sort of pre-built patterns is, at least at this stage of the game, we don't need to worry about our patterns not being perfectly seamless on the edges. So create a new layer here. This is our new subtle net. Grab that Paint Bucket tool. Here we go again. Grab the last pattern. Dump it right in there. Great. And we're going to set this guy to multiply. And very subtle. And we're going to reduce the opacity of this as well, I believe. Let's bump up the opacity of the one below it just a little bit, maybe to 30. And this one, we're going to set this one to about 25, 30, something like that as well. To this point, we've got a pretty dark texture. And while dark textures can be nice, a lot of times if they're hanging around sort of this 50% gray, maybe a little bit brighter than 50% gray range, they can tend to be pretty dull, especially, I mean, just imagine this is going to be your complete seamless background for an entire web or website. So usually either a really dark pattern or a really light pattern are really going to be what work best for that, because I mean, people have a 30-inch wide monitor or even bigger. So, you know, you've got all kinds of space on either side of the content section of your website, and just try to visualize in your mind the pattern you're creating and how it's going to look over an entire user's monitor, not just this one little sample size that we're looking at. So with that in mind, we're going to try to make this a little bit brighter. So that brings us back to subtle patterns, and we're going to use another pattern here called light paper fibers. We're going to download this guy. I'm going to go to the desktop, and I'm going to extract it. There we go, unzip, yep, drop it on the desktop, perfect. And I'm going to use light paper fiber. Yeah, I think I'll just go with the smaller of the two textures. Open it up in Photoshop, and again, I'm just going to go right to Edit, Define Pattern, and I'm just going to leave it as its standard name. You can close that, and we're going to create a new layer, Control-Shift-Alt-N. Grab our Paint Bucket tool. Go to the pattern dropdown, grab that light paper fiber, and dump that in there. Now, all we're going to do is we're going to set this, let's try a blend mode of overlay or soft light, probably soft light in this case. And you can see that we're adding a little bit more texture, but most importantly, we're lightening up our entire pattern, our entire texture here. So that's really great. That's really going to help us out here. Now, the last thing we're going to do, well, the last texture that we're going to add, I should say, is a texture called Vichy. We're going to come back to subtle patterns. You can punch that in. It's V-I-C-H-Y. Download this pattern. You can see it's sort of this cool, almost plaid Scotch looking pattern. And I'm going to unzip just the smaller of these images, just because. Go ahead and unzip it. And here it is. So I'm going to drag this guy into Photoshop as well. Open it up. And I'm going to zoom in so we can really get a look at this pattern. So you can see kind of a more intricate pattern, pretty cool, looks pretty neat. Now that we have this open, I'm going to actually lighten this up a little bit. So Command or Control L, that's the same as just going Image Adjustments Levels. Note the hotkey, Control L, Command or Control L. Open that up. Now what I want to do is I want to drag the black slider over here. So we're going to introduce a little bit of contrast. We're going to just drag this over to, let's say right about there. That looks good. So input of 130, let's say right around 130, between 130 and 140 should be good. And let's drag the white slider over to right about just the edge of the histogram, or the edge of our little peak here in the histogram. So let's say 224. We could even just round it up to 225, and that would be perfect. So you can see there's before, there's after. We're lightening the entire thing, and we're adding a little bit of contrast just to make this interesting. So I'll go ahead and hit OK, and we're going to define this as a pattern. Edit, Define Pattern. You can just leave it as Vichy. Okay. We can close this. Nah, I don't need to save it. Create another new layer. Grab that Paint Bucket tool. Again, it's set to pattern, and we're going to grab that new pattern, and we're going to pour it right in there. There we go. And with this one, let's maybe not use a blend mode, but rather let's just reduce the opacity. Knock it down to, let's say, 25 or 30. 25 looks good. Right around 30, actually, that looks pretty good, because we can just sort of see our mosaics behind these diagonal lines. So that looks kind of cool. And then all the other textures are sort of doing intermediate work in between. Again, it's all about subtlety. Think about subtlety. We want this to be very, very, very subtle in every aspect. And before we actually create a seamless repeating pattern out of this pattern that we're creating, let's just add some noise, just a little bit of grain, just to add even another layer of texture. So create a new layer. Boom. Create a new layer. And we're going to go Edit, Fill. And we're going to use 50% gray. Hit OK. You can see it just fills it right in with 50% gray. Now, before we add noise, you do want to make sure that your foreground and background colors are set to black and white. If they're not, the quick hotkey to set them to black and white is just hit the letter D. It's going to set your foreground color to black and your background color to white. Go Filter, Noise, Add Noise, and let's say 100% is way too much. Let's try something like 5%. So it's a fair bit of noise for a document this size, but I think that's what we're going to want so we can at least see some of that texture. And then we're going to set this noise layer to a blend mode of soft light. So you can see before, after. We're just adding just a little bit of depth to our little pattern here. So now that we've done that, we want to go ahead and merge all of these layers to a new layer. And we can do this using a hotkey, Control-Shift-Alt or Command-Shift-Option-E. So we're popping everything up to this layer, and we can just name that layer pattern. So we've taken all these layers that we've just built, boom, merged them up into this one layer. And now with this layer, we're going to create our seamless background, or our seamless pattern, I should say. So we're going to go Filter, Other, Offset. Now, this is where things get interesting, because remember, we created this document. It's 500 pixels wide by 400 pixels tall. So what we want to do is set the horizontal and verticals here of our offset to half the width and half the height of our document. So you can see here 250 pixels and 200 pixels vertical. 200 is half of 400, perfect. 250 is half of 500, perfect. Now for undefined areas, let's just leave it set to wrap around and hit OK. So what we've got here is a pattern. See, if I shut this pattern off, see, it's different than the one beneath it, because we've just taken this one and we've created a repeating pattern out of this. Now what we may want to do is just zoom in and double check and make sure we don't have anything that looks funny. Now, because we have this mosaic pattern underneath, we really have pretty clean seams, because remember, each of these little boxes is 20 pixels and 20 fits into 400 a number of times. We don't need to worry about boxes being split and all kinds of weird things happening to them. It all seems to fit together fine, but sometimes you'll have little weird lines and things you may have to go in. If that does happen with your pattern, when it's a pattern like this that's, random or has just nothing that really follows anything, you can go ahead and grab the healing brush or the spot healing brush and just do, well, the brush is a little too big. You can just go in and just do little minor touch-ups to make sure that everything looks great. Just stay away from the edges, because the edges are all set to just perfectly repeat one after another. So just something to keep in mind if you do see little blemishes and things like that you're like, that's definitely something people are going to pick out and realize that's a repeating pattern. So just go ahead and use the healing brush and you can clone them right out. It's really, really simple to do. So now we're going to go Edit, Define Pattern, and we're going to name this our pattern. Doesn't that look great? Hit OK, and we've got our pattern. Now, all we really have to do is jump back over to our website and say, hey, website, you know what? We've got our background here. We're going to apply this pattern. Now, there's a number of ways we can apply the pattern. We can go ahead and just apply it like we've been applying patterns with the paint bucket tool. However, a lot of times when I'm building website comps in Photoshop, I don't quite know exactly how long the website needs to be. So, for instance, this website is supposed to be one-page website. So there's not really going to be, there are going to be other sort of exterior pages, but virtually all of the content and information is going to be here on the front page. It's going to be a very long front page. So all of these navigation bars, like when you hit films, it's going to scroll down to the film section. Then you can see we still have a section we need to create for music, Festival 2012, About Us, photos, and social media. So this website's going to need to continue pretty far down below where we've created already. So with that in mind, instead of dumping in the pattern using the paint bucket tool, which, the problem is that fills this portion of the screen, but then when I go, hey, image, canvas size, and I need to increase the height to like 4,000, right? So it's just going to go, give it a second, and then, well, you can see the rest of the website that I had started creating. But we'd have all of this additional background that we would need to go in and fill stuff in behind, but our pattern would stop right here at the edge of the white. So we combat that by taking this layer. If it's your background layer, just Alt double click it to unlock it. We're going to apply a layer style. So we're going to go Layer. Where is it? It's Layer Style. There we go. It's as if I've never used Photoshop before. Layer Style, Pattern Overlay. So this is just going to take our background, say it's our white background, and now we've got this ridiculous looking floral pattern, but we happen to know that we just created a pattern. This guy right here, our pattern. And we can set that and see that's what it looks like. So there's before with the solid white background. Now that we've added the pattern, we can see, well, we have some design that we had created, knowing that we were going to drop a pattern in, but also we immediately set off the content portion of the website with the background. Now, if that background's still too dark, remember, we have this white beneath it, so we can just reduce the opacity of our pattern to something like maybe 40%, and we've got a very nice, subtle, light background for our website. So that's it. We can zoom in. Here's the website at 100%, and everything is starting to work now because we have our pattern, and if I were to expand below, we'd be able to just drag this white and keep filling in with white on this layer, which I can call this background. I can keep filling in just solid white, and wherever solid white is, it's automatically going to apply this pattern at 40% opacity because it's a live layer style. So kind of a cool way to apply your patterns, but that's how you create a pattern, that's how you create a seamless pattern, and that's how you apply that pattern in your own web designs and in your own website designs when you're mocking them up in Photoshop. So definitely something that you want to keep in mind when you're working on graphic design projects and web design projects is this idea of subtle patterns. You can see it just sets everything off. It's a little bit different than just a solid gray background. It adds just this feel like it's something tangible, something you can touch, but it's really on the screen, and it just adds this really nice element of subtle beauty to any project, graphic or web, that you work on. So that's it for this one. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thanks for sticking around and watching the whole thing. Go check out the site. That's www.tutvid.com for other free video tutorials. See you guys later.